going to reflect on the notes that I took and deepen them a little bit so that you can have the benefit of that. I think it's hard sometimes to be introduced to systems theory when you've had no exposure. And Fritjof is a scientist, and so he's very precise, very clear in the way he talks about things. And that's for him the beauty of systems language, because it's precise. And if you're not used to it, it doesn't sound precise at all. It just kind of sounds weird. So I'm going to sort of try and unbundle some of that so that it is more user-friendly, shall we say. But I also want to talk about the applications. Why, who cares? I mean, why does it matter? What difference does it make to think about this? And that's where I'm passionate. I love this stuff. I can't tell you. It has just opened my eyes to look at the dynamics, because we're so blinded. We've been taught to see in parts and pieces, and that's really confusing. You've got a smattering of stuff all over that you see all the time, but it doesn't make sense. You don't see how it's related, how it's connected. And that's part of the reason why it's overwhelming, is because there's so much stuff. And when you can start to see the patterns and the connections, you're actually dealing with fewer things, not with more things. And not only that, they make sense. You can kind of see why they're doing what they're doing. And so for me, that's one of the really huge gifts. So he talked about biological, social, ecological, and cognitive systems. And so he sort of does that. So we will go through that. But there are some really key pieces that I want to talk about before that, because I think that it's really, really important to understand, some really basic fundamental pieces of that. The first thing he started out with, and it's actually something that I ended up with, and it took me a long time to get here, was really understanding the true morality of life, what's really ethical. I've been pursuing ethics my entire life because I was totally unsatisfied with all the stories I was getting from people. And what it came down for me finally was that the ethics of life is about supporting life. And guess what? That's exactly what he said. That the normal ways of living should not, cannot interfere with nature's ability to sustain life. That is the moral and ethical issue in a nutshell. If you get nothing else out of this whole network, get that. Because if you really start to see and understand that, and that's the whole point of living regeneratively, in my opinion, is to begin to discern when what we do interferes with nature's ability to sustain life. When what we do interferes with the ability of whatever being is in front of us to flourish. If it's not flourishing, if we're doing something that impedes its ability to flourish, if we're not valuing our kids, if we're dismissing what they say, if we're damaging their spirit, that is interfering with nature's ability to sustain life. When people have no self-esteem, that interferes with their ability to flourish. That's why, I mean, this is so fundamental. And this isn't just we're thinking that this is a good idea. We're not deciding that that's true. This is how the planet works. And we must do that too. The separation we've had from nature, from the planet, not paying attention, not understanding how the life around us is healthy and vibrant. Because we've been so separated from that, we just do stuff that interferes with nature's ability to sustain life all the time. And so we have to sharpen our ability to see that so that we don't do it anymore. I mean, that for me is like so huge. I can't tell you. He talks about networks. But more importantly, he talks about the relationships in those networks and that understanding how things are connected and interdependent, all those words, but that network is a new understanding of how life happens for science. This is new, just in 30 years, this has come up. And that's, again, we're not talking parts and pieces, we're talking wholes. That's what systems are about, is wholes. Nature is filled with wholes, wholes that are interconnected. That's what a network is. It's a relationship of wholes. And it itself is a whole. But that relationship, and this is again one of those key and fundamental things, that relationship is not competitive. It is a cooperative dance with creativity and novelty. In one of the Friday talks, we talked about the Galapagos finches and their beaks. This is a group of birds that live on an island, and they have been so thoroughly researched for 50 years, I think. There's a science guy who's been going out there every year for 50 years, measuring the beaks of these birds. And he knows their whole history for generations back. So he can say with certainty that the ancestor looked like this and this bird looks like that. And so the question was, why the change and how fast they change? And they change not to be competitive, but to find a niche where they fit, where they're no longer competitive, but cooperative. And that's the key. We see it like this. And that doesn't work, because when you're doing that, there's no fit. And it's the fit that makes things thrive. Finding your space, finding the place where you contribute you. That's why you, the unique being that you are so dramatically important. Nobody else fills that space but you. That's why you fit. But when you're trying to be someone else or act like someone else or not be who you are, you don't fit, and you feel it. You can tell you don't fit. And that leads to all sorts of other things. This is why I think this stuff is so magical. It truly explains the situations that we're in, and it helps us see what to do about it. And again, it's not just a good idea. This is what's truly real about the world we live in. The other thing to know about systems is that because it's about wholes, and Fritjof says this, the things that we're seeing, the actions, the patterns that happen in our life are properties of the whole, not the parts. So your personality, the way you show up in the world, is you. It's the whole you. It's not your fingers. It's not your little toe. It's not your earlobe. It's the whole you. And the parts, while our hands are different, some are long-fingered, some are short, some are thick, some are thin, that's not who we are. The properties that are us are expressed by the whole. So we're looking at wholes, and that's very important. It's the property of the whole, not of the parts. And that is particularly important when we get into cognition, our mind, our brain, and all of that. So I'll deal with that later. But networks are the basic pattern of all life. Then he touched on, and he didn't go very deeply into, but this is another really magical piece, and that's autopoiesis. I mean, it's just amazing. Life self-organizes, it self-forms. And I'm going to jump ahead, I guess, a little bit with that, because from the systems viewpoint, what the science is now telling us is, to the best of our knowledge, life started in this primordial swamp when proteins got together. And when they got together, they stuck. And when they stuck, that created a different potential than a protein all by itself. That makes sense? And that potential is what actually became life. Now, I still have a little quibble about that myself personally, but that's okay. What it's really saying is that life moves into complexity. It becomes more complex over time. But because it does that, it has to change structures. The structure can't stay the same. I mean, you have a structure with the cell, and then it can't do anything. It has to change its structure in order to join another cell. That's a new thing for both of those pieces. So that choice, the consciousness, the cognition that said, me, not me, join, whatever cognition made that happen is how living systems self-organize and create networks. We self-make. So auto is self, and poiesis is the Greek for making, self-making. That's what the word means. That's magical. That is magical. We have total control over our world. Total. That does not mean we control things that are not us, but we control the world we make, which is mostly up here, right? It's our understanding of the world is what we do. I mean, you've heard this before. This is not sort of like new verbiage, you know. I came out of est in my recent memory, talking about how you have control over your world and how you can change your attitude and the world changes and all that kind of stuff. That's what it's talking about. That's what it meant. It didn't know it at the time, I don't believe, but that's what it means. Because we have the ability to cognate, to be able to see the difference between whatever we define as self and the exterior world, we are always deciding how to interact with that world, what part of it to make into us, to take into ourselves as part of us, and what part of it to push away from and not be. But those are choices. Those are decisions that everything makes. That is so phenomenal, so phenomenal. I'm going to come back to this point as I go down this list of notes that I've gotten. That is just amazing, amazing. It gives us incredible power, incredible capacity, and that we're using our creativity to seek the newness that relationship offers. So as we respond, interact, discern about what is not us, and make choices about how we're going to relate to that, that is where we create our world. It's those decisions, those choices that make the world we inhabit. That is amazing, just amazing. So Fritjof goes on to say that being able to understand this integration is really one of the gifts of living system science. And that nonlinear dynamics, which has come up in the last 30 years also, is the mathematics that allows us to understand the pattern of relationships. when we self-organize, one of the amazing things about that is that as you learn about your environment and respond, adapt to it, you change, but you never lose your sense of identity. Now that's phenomenal, that you can be different and the same at the same time. That is phenomenal. And it's unique to life. It's one of the things life does. So the Santiago theory of consciousness talks about how the processes in our mind, our consciousness, allows us to change and have a sense of ourself and to make our world, and that is what life does. That is almost a definition of life. Anything that has the ability to cognate, to discern the difference between self and something else, and then to make choices about that something else through cognition in order to manage, adapt, and interact with the complexity of everything else around it. That's life. What can I say? I mean, this is just, for me, euphoric stuff that we can do. That's us, that's us. It's also a worm. It's also a butterfly. It's also an owl. And it's also a plant. And it's a bacteria. It's all aspects of life do this. But we do it too. And not only do we do it, once you see that, you have the experience of that. You know the truth of that. The truth is here. It's in your own experience. You don't need these words. You don't need somebody to tell you about how you do it. You can recognize that for yourself. What an amazing amount of power that is that we have. One of the things I've taught for years that I really, really love, which speaks to autopoiesis, is that when you make a choice or a decision, if you do that over time, that over timeness creates a pattern. We could call that a habit of what we're doing. And if we do that long enough, that pattern becomes a structure. So when we think about the difference between our brain and our mind, the brain is the part that processes, and it does that over and over and over again. Those synapses connect or disentangle, depending on whether you're thinking a lot about something or you stop thinking about something. And that changes the structure in your brain. So the brain is the structure that holds the process, that reflects the processes that you go through. And you're starting to hear that you can change the structure of your brain by changing the way you think about things and the habits that you form with your thoughts in mind. And that's absolutely true. So it's decision, process, pattern, structure. Decision, process, pattern, and structure. Amazing. A lot of our structures, the structures that really get us into trouble, are invisible. We don't see them. So that's why we don't think about this. But I'm going to ask you to fold your arms. Cross your arms like I'm doing. Now I want you to cross them the other way. Okay, so you got to kind of think about what that is. And it doesn't feel comfortable because you have a structure in your mind, this one, that says what it should be. And when you undo it, it doesn't feel right. It feels weird because there's no structure for this yet. If you habitually changed your mind and did this all the time, this would feel comfortable. And when you had to undo it this way, that would feel uncomfortable. So that's an experience of the decision process, pattern, structure that we put into our bodies, into our minds all the time. Smoking. People who give up smoking will tell you the smell of a cigarette can start that process that triggers that pattern that you've had of smoking all the time. Seeing other people can trigger that pattern, and that pattern can be overwhelming. It forces the structure of smoking. It takes a long time to shift those patterns so they don't trigger that structural response. So cognition comes before consciousness. When we talked about life moving toward complexity, that's what another expression of that. So very simple organisms can cognate. They can recognize hot and cold. They can recognize food, not food. They can recognize friendly or enemy. Those are basic things, but they're not necessarily thinking about them. They don't have the consciousness that would help them discern more subtle things around that. But as life got more complex, many organisms attached together, then with that complexity comes a fuller consciousness. So consciousness is an expression of the complexity of cognition. As cognition becomes more complex, it becomes conscious. Well, then Fritjof talked about evolution. And evolution is about increasing complexity. That's what it is. As things learn, as you get to be better at your discernment, then you have a range of possibilities that you didn't have before. If it's just hot or just cold, that's one thing. Maybe it's not that hot, or maybe it's barely hot, or maybe it's on the way to being hot, but not hot yet. This is a whole range of things, a huge increase in complexity between hot and cold. So as we discern, as we become self-aware, we're able to manage a richer, more complex environment. That is inherent in all living systems. Every living system learns to some extent. And for systems people, what Fritjof said was that evolution, instead of being the simple understanding of random mutations and natural selections, which was what Darwin saw, which is absolutely true, they have systems people have added two other capacities or two other ways of looking at how evolution happens. And they've had to do that because we now know more about our world than we did, 50 or 100 years ago. One of the big shifts that has really come to the fore in recent years is how bacteria and viruses mutate. They mutate by changing genes horizontally. It's not the sexual recreation where they come together and then are born into something else. No, it's just like, and I'm going to use the same example that he used from Lynn Margulis. It's like jumping into a pool with brown eyes and you come out with blue because somebody said, oh, here, you can have blue eyes now. Great. So it's a direct exchange of stuff, and that's different. But it makes a new organism, a different organism. Some subtle changes have happened. And then there's symbiosis. As those changes happen, there's a fine-tuning of that difference. And that fine-tuning becomes solidified into a new organism that then keeps that change and passes it on. So those are three different ways of accounting for the learning that we do, the kind of discernment that we do. And here's one of those just euphoric other pieces that he brought up, is that when you talk about random mutations, yes, chance plays a role, things just happen. But the desire to keep that mutation, that symbiotic piece, the desire to integrate that change into who you are is choice. So it's cognitive, it's complex, and it's ordered. And for me, this is the most brilliant, crystal clear, wonderful explanation of why a hummingbird would develop a long nose so that only that species of hummingbird can drink from that long flower that requires that long nose to get down to the end. Why did they agree to do that? I have always been amazed at how species interact. Why do they make those choices? What happens to make those choices? Birds on the backs of rhinos, fish that go to be cleaned, choose a place to go, know where that place is, so that other fish will take the bugs off them. Come on. That's how that happens. That's how that happens. You see and understand and then integrate that into who you are. And then we're on our way to evolution. That's how those relationships form. Just gives me goosebumps to think about. Just magical stuff. Well, and then Fritjof went into social autopoiesis. Now, this is really interesting. I'm hoping you're seeing how practical this stuff is. It's not airy-fairy by any means. It is so practical. It gives you a much better understanding of how the world works. If you know that your children, if you know that your neighbor is going to watch what you do and either choose to take it into themselves and accept it or not, you can begin to understand the power you have and the responsibility you have to work with that relationship with respect. We take in things that have value to us and that we appreciate. We don't take in things that are painful or harmful. You get more with honey. Being nice makes a difference. Again, social networks, okay, relationships with family and friends and strangers is immaterial. You don't see that network, and yet you recognize it and you know it's there. You feel comfortable when there are people that you know in your neighborhood, when you have names and relationships, even if they're tiny, with the people around you, you feel safe. And you begin to create a culture of behavior that you kind of expect, that everybody has sort of agreed upon. So think about the block you live on. Is there a grouch who screams and yells and calls names at everybody? So now there's an agreement amongst all the people around that person about how to handle that. Do you call the police on her? Do you dump garbage in her yard just because? What do you do? What does everybody do, even though you probably don't even talk about it, in order to deal with that personality? That's a culture that you have created, and culture is created by feedback loops. So you do something, maybe you went and yelled back at her and saw what the result was. She just kept yelling, didn't make any real big difference, doesn't make you feel good. You've got to listen to all of that stuff, makes her louder and more insistent. Yeah, maybe yelling's not a good idea. So now you've changed your attitude. You've changed the way you're going to enter. You had a feedback loop that gave you some way of discerning the effects of your actions. And now you get to make a choice. Do you want to keep dumping garbage in her, or do you just want to ignore her? Maybe if you ignore her, she'll go away. It's another option. You can try that. You could drop off cookies. There's all sorts of things one can do that's learned behavior, because you experiment to see if it works. And you decide, because of feedback loops, to persist in that behavior or not, to share it with other people or not, depending on how successful it was. And that's what creates culture. That's what creates group norms. You look around, notice what other people are doing, and you do it too. It's easy. When you do that, you feel like you've become a member of the community. You now fit. So we make choices on our behavior to do that or not. Some people don't want to do that. Some people are fighting back. I don't want to act like that. That's not me. I don't like it. Doesn't make me feel comfortable. And they don't feel like they fit. And when they don't fit, they kind of always are doing stuff because they actually do want to get in. They do want to fit. They just haven't figured out how to do it in a way that feels like they're staying the same, even though they're changing. Isn't this stuff magical? I don't know what else to say about it. So Fritjof went on, and I'm just going to go through this. I didn't put it in my notes, but it will be in the notes that I'm going to put underneath this video. That he talked about how to apply this. And the first is to understand that we're seeing patterns of behavior. It's not about the oil company. I'll tell you another place where I have found understanding patterns just really, really useful. We had a president a few years ago that had a particular characteristic. And while I didn't like that person and I didn't respect that person's way of being, and I didn't support that person, that was that person. Then I had another experience with another person who was kind and gentle and in a very different position. And I began to see patterns of behavior between the two that were similar. That was very useful. So what I'm referring to is a personality characteristic called narcissism. And I really encourage you to learn a little bit about it, because narcissism is a pattern of behavior. And there are certain things that you see in every narcissist. One is the resistance to being wrong. A narcissist cannot be wrong. So a narcissist pulls toward them people who love them, who tell them how great they are. A narcissist will drop or diss anybody who says something that suggests that they're wrong. Have we seen behavior like this? We've got a guy who's bombing another country with the same pattern of behavior. Now, when you see that pattern, that tells you how to interact with that person. The more we tell Putin that he's wrong, the firmer he gets in his rightness. You can't say he's wrong. So it becomes another situation altogether in what kind of behavior do you want, or does anybody want to express in their relationship with a person like that, that will get them to be different, telling them how great they are if they do something different is one way of approaching that. But telling them they're wrong will not work, will absolutely not work. So think about that. We're talking about the same kind of thing, understanding patterns, understanding wholes, understanding feedback loops. And then we're always trying to create a balance. And a person who has been so damaged, and in my limited experience, every person I know who has been narcissistic has had horrible childhoods, mostly from fathers, but not totally, mostly from fathers. And the fathers have been beating on their kids to get rid of all the nice tendencies that they have to be kind and generous and all of that. They're to be obedient and manage themselves. And so if they decide that they're not bad and they're going to do their own thing because they're not bad, they're not going to believe that parent, and their parent has told them what to do over and over and over again, then part of their mind says, I'm never going to listen. I'm never going to be told what to do. Do we see that pattern? If we see that pattern, then it's not a good idea to tell that person what to do. You know that, so you get to make another choice. Another point that he makes in terms of applications is one, unlimited growth is not possible. Growth in the real world always has limits. You know, elephants can get only so big. If they get too big, then their bodies don't function really well. We've not quite got that. We've got businesses now, corporations that are huge, way bigger than they should be. And we're starting to see the results of that. They're hard to manage. The feedback loops have to be really big to get their attention. We're starting to see that as well. It's what climate change is all about. The point of feedback loops is to bring the system back into balance so that it all works. One of the interesting things he said, though, which I think is really true because of the very first thing I started with, he said that the financial culture that we have around finances and economics is immoral. I didn't use those words, but that's what I interpret them to be. There's no moral framework. Why? Because they are not paying attention to how they interfere with nature's ability to support life. The things, so many of the things that drive that economic system are things that interfere with nature's ability to support life. Yes, we kind of see that. But to be able to say that, and then to be able to really discern when that's happening, what a gift. What a gift. What a gift. So he is talking about qualitative growth, using the quality of life and its ability to increase complexity and to thrive as the discerning measure for what's appropriate. Brilliant. Brilliant. I wholeheartedly agree. Understanding the qualities of things. We all know this. And it's been so frustrating to see that tension between, no, it's numbers. Well, it's not numbers. You can have 5,000 badly made things, and that's not as good as 10 well-made things. But you made 5,000. Is that, it's bigger, it's better. It's not better. We know that. But we're caught in a system that measures stuff, measures bigness, numbers, and amounts. And we know it's not right. But the question has been what to replace it with. And so Fritjof's suggestion is that it's the quality, the ability of whatever is produced to enhance the quality of life, to enhance nature's ability to support life, to help the life thrive. If it's thriving, it's a good thing. Now, there's a subtle discernment here. There was a situation, I guess, in the 50s, and so don't hold me to that. It was called the Green Revolution. And it had to do with a shift in rice in a way that made it more nutritious and easier to grow in drought things, in drought situations. And what that did was it made more abundant food. That sounds like a thriving, doesn't it? The problem is, and this is where the feedback loops come in. So when there's more food, populations increase. That's what life does. But when nature does it, when populations increase, there's a point at which they overshoot the capacity of the ecological system they're in, and then they die. We are clever. And so we constantly are working on how to maintain that overshoot instead of being responsible and allowing that overshoot to happen. We do not understand yet how to manage a thriving life in a way that doesn't take us into overshoot. And what that does, when we overshoot the system, when we borrow from the future, basically, which is the oil thing, we're using it up now, we won't have it later. So we're borrowing from the future, and we're doing it in a way that seems to expand our capacity, but it's not really expanding our capacity because we're not being present. It's not about now, it's about the future. And when you take away the future, then you have to pay for that at some point in time, because you'll have to do without when you get there, which is where we are right now, where we're going. We haven't developed the ecological literacy to see and understand how to manage that. We work so hard at keeping ourselves alive that we're diminishing nature's ability to support other life and ultimately our own, because we depend on all that other life that nature is supporting. And when she can't do it, the whole thing is going to collapse. Does this make sense to you? Can you see how important it is to fit, to be part of, to have relationships that thrive, and to understand how to manage those boundaries instead of so willfully choosing to ignore them, which is what we've done. We must not interfere with nature's ability to support life. And if that means keeping our numbers down within a certain limit, that's good. Because if we do that, we have incredible flexibility within that constraint. When we go out of that constraint, our flexibility diminishes. And that's the start of where we are now. It's been happening for a while, but we haven't paid attention. But now the feedback loops are getting strong enough that we are definitely going to begin to see that our options are getting smaller and smaller because there's nothing left for us to play with. We've gotten rid of it. We've killed everything else. Species loss, that's what that means. That's why that's important. The fewer species there are, the simpler life is becoming, not more complex. Life becomes more complex, we're taking it backwards, and that's death. We can't survive on a simpler planet. We need a more complex planet in order to hold our capacity. And we're not doing that. We're dampening down the planet. We're eliminating it, making it simpler. We don't have thousands of different kinds of potatoes. We have 5 or 6. 5 or 6 is not resilient. You have 1,000 potatoes, that's pretty resilient. You may lose 500 of them and you still have potatoes. If you only have 5 or 6 and you lose 4, you get 1 or 2 left. That's not very resilient. That's pretty dangerous. And that's where we're going. We're creating a simpler and simpler planet, getting rid of all the stuff we don't like, all the bugs, all the discomfort, all of that stuff we're getting rid of. And that's dampening down the planet's capacity to thrive, to generate new life, to generate novelty. We're standardizing, making things the same. Life doesn't do that. There are no 2 living things the same, period. I don't care where you look, what it is. Nothing is the same. Because if it's the same, it doesn't fit. It's got to fit. And if 2 things are the same, they pile up and you get stacks of stuff, but no fit. So it's just fragile. It collapses because it can't, there's nothing to hang on to. It's the fit that keeps it stable. It's the fit that makes it last. And that takes time to fit. It takes a lot of agreements that have to be made, a lot of changes that have to be made by every part of the system to fit. That's why old growth forests are so important, because they have spent millions of years making those agreements so that everything works. And we come along and take a part out and say, oh, well, go ahead. Well, it can't. It needs the rest of that to fit. Diversity is so key. It's difference that makes resilience. It's difference that allows for fit. It is difference that we need to support, not similarity. So he ends his talk, as they ended the book, by 3 strategies. And I'm not going to go into those. You can research them. They're all books. So Plan B, Reinventing Fire, and the Third Industrial Revolution are the 3 books. So maybe it would be fun actually to read all 3 and see what we can get from that. The whole point is to help us fit and to appreciate and value that fit, because it's fit that's going to keep us alive. It's being fit that's going to make it all work. It's fit, it's difference that we need in order to be truly resilient. So anyway, that's it. That's my sort of synopsis and exploration of Fritjof's brilliant work. I hope it's useful. I hope it makes more sense to you. Please put comments below. Tell me that it worked for you, it didn't work for you, that you had insights, that you have questions, whatever, so that we can have a dialogue about this. And thank you so much for paying attention. Bye for now.